today we are going to talk about the end of the Cold War. We're going to talk about it in probably two parts. So first we're going to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the second thing we're going to talk about is the end of communism in China. So first, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we're going to kind of go back to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, under President Nixon, the United States and the Soviet Union enter a phase called détente. So détente is a French word that kind of means the easing of tensions. So like day, like as in to undo, taunt, think like tension. And so because of that, we don't see a lot of like the Cold War type stuff happening. The arms race kind of slows down. The space race slows down. Both countries take steps back from the edge of that mad, mutually assured destruction. And that really lasts until 1979. And in 1979, the USSR makes a pretty devastating mistake. In 1979, they invade Afghanistan. So, down over here. And they do this kind of, there are these kind of communist rebels within Afghanistan, and Afghanistan had this rising middle class. They'd had a parliamentary democracy, and the communist factions within the government kind of recruit the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union looking to kind of bolster itself and support itself and kind of, revitalize things, decides that they're going to support this communist group in Afghanistan, and they're going to invade. It's really, really a bad decision. So the best that they ever are able to do is kind of occupy the cities, and they use force in order to keep the kind of control over things. And they're constantly fighting this rebel group. This rebel group is called the Mujahideen. That's a J. Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen is using guerrilla warfare. They're being funded by the United States, and they're fighting the Soviet Union. And essentially it becomes the Soviet Union's Vietnam War. It lasts from 1979 until 1989. So for 10 years, Soviet troops are fighting in Afghanistan. And it has a very shockingly similar effect in the Soviet Union like the Vietnam War did in the United States. So whereas the Vietnam War was very controversial, how it caused a lot of division within the United States, caused a lot of protests, caused a lot of anger. A lot of people felt that, only certain people are being drafted for the war. The same feelings arise in the Soviet Union. And they arise really even coming from these satellite states, right? Like the Baltics, for example. I think I've probably talked about in your class, maybe it was just an AP, but there's this podcast that I listen to. It's called The Eastern Border. And in The Eastern Border, he's Latvian, the host. He's about my age, and he talks about like what everyone's life was like in Estonia during the Soviet occupation. It's a really great perspective to get. And he has a series of episodes about the invasion of Afghanistan. Then I also read a memoir called The Unbroken Circle about an upper-class Afghan family who has to flee. They have to flee Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, when the Soviets come. And so it's just this really awful situation for the Soviet Union. And Afghanistan seems to be a really difficult area. The Mujahideen, for example, become the Taliban, who we end up attacking in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks because they had housed Al-Qaeda. So when you see here in this political cartoon, right, there's this big tank burial ground, and it says the Russians were here, right? The Russians got trapped. And then since we still have troops in Afghanistan, right, it's arguable that we've been trapped in an Afghan quagmire as well. So in the early 1980s, the man who comes to power in the Soviet Union, his name is Mikhail, it's Russian for Michael, Gorbachev. And he was a noted reformer. So what they start noticing is that their command economy, where the government controls everything with kind of the 5-year plans and the quota system and all of that, that it really was failing, that the economy had stagnated, that there was a lot of inefficiency and waste, that people didn't have a lot of consumer goods and they complained about the ones that they had, right? You couldn't go shopping. You couldn't buy a nice new car. You couldn't buy new furniture. You couldn't get new electronics. These were things that you couldn't have. And there was a lot of censorship of the press so that the Soviet citizens didn't really always know what they didn't have, but a lot of it got through. So there was this big black market of Western goods, which started to make the whole kind of moral argument behind communism not work, right? Because if communism is supposed to be this workers' paradise, then like, why is there this big black market of goods that are coming from capitalism? Right? It's obvious that the people were not happy. And then the arms race and the space race had really just broken the economy. They couldn't keep up. So Gorbachev comes to power in the 80s, and he decides that he's going to institute some reforms in order to revitalize, I feel like I've used that word a lot, revitalize the Soviet economy. So the first reform that he puts into place is called perestroika, which means restructuring. And what it does is it allows for some small-scale private business, opportunities for private farms, and some foreign investment. He also allows for the implementation of political and social reforms as well, and those are called glasnost. So glasnost means openness. So he loosens up censorship restrictions. He allows for cultural and intellectual freedom, so in terms of literature, in terms of movies, in terms of newspapers, in terms of books. And what that does is, rather than giving people a forum to assist him in his reform process, they attack him brutally. They attack him, they attack Stalin, they attack Lenin, they attack the system, they attack their leaders. They show how amazingly corrupt and inefficient their own kind of local leaders are. It exposes all of the crime and poor living conditions that people are living in. And so it kind of just like explodes in his face, right? He thinks that he's doing a good thing for the Soviet Union. He thinks that if he can allow for some small scale like reintroduction of capitalism and some freedom of the press, that people will become kind of reinvigorated with the socialist spirit, and they'll all work together to really create the workers' paradise that they had fallen off track from. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the economy goes into a tailspin because he kind of like lets the chains off so quickly. A market-based system hadn't had time to form. So instead, this like a black market develops. No foreign firms are actually interested in investing in the Soviet Union. So he's not able to generate funds that way. And it ends up really bad. He also creates a new parliament that has like real power and that people can actually vote for their representatives. And so when he holds that first parliamentary election, all of the not all, that's an exaggeration, most of the leading communist representatives lose, which kind of shows how over it the people are. And it also generates this sense of nationalism, if we go back, right, in all of these places. So once they can say that, like, we're Latvian and not Soviet and we would like to be Latvian. They they don't want to. And one of Gorbachev's kind of underlying ideas is he doesn't want to put down any protests. So when the Estonians and the Latvians and the Polish and the Czechs all basically overthrow their Soviet appointed leaders, he doesn't send in the troops. He doesn't send in the tanks. He lets it happen. And so that kind of quickly and suddenly weakens the Soviet Union in a way that it really can't survive. So here are some political cartoons that you can see. Kind of, here he is. He's always, you can't see it here, but he has this very identifiable birthmark on his forehead. And so here it is. And this is his perestroika domino. And it's this domino that's eventually going to collapse the CCCP, the Soviet Union. And then here is a political cartoon about Glasnost, right? So here it is as this baby he's trying to carry, but it's been beating him up, yelling democracy and freedom. And he says, if she's like this as a baby, what will she be like when she's grown up? This idea that the Glasnost is overwhelming, right? That he is not going to survive it. And he literally survives it, but his government does not. The Soviet Union is declared dead, basically. There's one morning where he goes to the podium and he's like, the Soviet Union as a political entity no longer exists. And just like that, it's over. But it says, right, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think this is such a cool quote, and I think it really gets at the history of it. The collapse of the Soviet Union, like the disintegration of past empires, is a process rather than an event. So, yes, that day he gets up on the podium and he says the Soviet Union no longer exists. But, it had been collapsing for a while. It was part of a larger process that ended in him making that speech, but it didn't start that way.